Thank you everyone for attending. My name is Dr. Julia Kazmaier, and today I'm presenting a new forms of data training on behalf of the UK Data Services. Today's webinar is called Adding Real-World GIS and Census Data to Agent-Based Modeling for Social Scientists. Today's webinar is the second in a series of 3, all on the topic of agent-based modeling for social scientists. The first webinar introduced the theory and concepts of agent-based modeling for social scientists. A recording of that webinar is already available to view on the UK GIS YouTube channel. The third seminar in 2 weeks will cover how to set up and run parameter sweeps and experiments. It will also address what to do with the output of those agent-based modeling experiments. To give you an overview of today's topics, I begin by demonstrating several ways to open models in NetLogo. Then I set up and run a custom-built Tram Commute Model using randomly generated data. Then I show you where to download some real-world data and how to prepare that for loading into the Tram Commute Model. I also show you what it looks like when that data is loaded into the model. So you can see it with the random data that I use originally and the real world data. And I talk a bit about how you might use a model like this in different social science sort of research contexts. I conclude with a summary of everything that I have covered in today's webinar. And of course, following the webinar, the demonstration portion of the webinar, there's some time for you to ask me some questions. So if everyone is ready, then let's get started. All right, if you have not already done so, you can go to Northwestern University's webpage to download NetLogo. It is free and it is available for all major computing platforms. NetLogo is quite a small program, so it downloads very quickly. When you first open NetLogo, you will see the interface tab of a new blank model. You can start adding to this blank model right away by hitting the options to add buttons or sliders and all these different things straight from the interface page. Or you can click over to the code tab to start writing code in the blank model. But most of the time, you will want to open a model that already exists rather than starting from a blank slate every time. To do that, go to the File menu in the upper left corner and you click, there are several different ways you can see here in the File menu of how to open existing models. I want to show you the Models library first. The Models library is built into NetLogo and it includes a large number of sample models. These models are built to address a wide variety of research questions. You can see here they range from art and biology down through philosophy, psychology, and social science. There's really a lot of interesting stuff in here. The model library also has code examples. These demonstrate well-written code that do various useful things in NetLogo. Unlike the sample models above, these models don't address research questions, but they do demonstrate how to do things that work. It's very useful. And of particular interest to us, there are code examples for the various NetLogo extensions, including the NetLogo GIS extension that we focus on today. Just a little bit more about the Models library because it is an absolute treasure trove of resources. Within most of the sample model categories, there's a subfolder of unverified models. These are models that work and that have had preliminary checks run on them, but they're still undergoing rigorous testing. So this means that the resources are really extensive. There's lots of different models you can look at. I also want to point out there's an online course that I believe is open to anyone to join and a set of models that accompany that. So you can really one-to-one interactive learning through NetLogo. There are also some models to accompany participatory systems and 2 different books about agent-based modeling. You can search through the models library using the search bar. And finally, although I could not get screen capture to include it, underneath the search bar is a link to an online community of user-created and submitted models that you can find many more examples of how researchers have used NetLogo. I absolutely recommend that you browse through the model library, both for the sample models and the code examples. You can mess around with these, you can change the code, you can do whatever you like. You cannot break them. So absolutely feel free to have a play. However, most of the time, you probably want to work on a model that you saved previously or that you've downloaded from someone else. For that, again, you go to File, but instead of going to the Models library, you go to Open, and then you navigate to where you have a saved NetLogo model. So here you see that I have navigated to my Tram Commute Model. Having opened my Tram Commute Model, I need to set it up with the random layout. This model simulates a sort of commuter region with a tram network, and it has places to live and places to go and commuters that move between those places. So first, I want to highlight that you select random from the projection dropdown. This tells the model that I want it to create a commuter region without any external input from maps. Then I decide on what I want, whether I want these switches to be on or off. I have turned off several to improve the way a model is displayed, but don't worry too much about these for right now. Now, after that, I set a few modeler input features. For example, I can decide on how many local authorities I want this tram commute area to cover, how many people I want in each of the local authorities, how many tram stops I want, how many places I want to give them to choose from to go to. Having chosen all of these, I then hit Setup. This tells the model to generate a commuter region and tram network according to the settings I've just selected. And this is what it looks like. Each color in this model represents a local authority. And that's according to the number that I chose before I hit Setup. But what the important thing here on this Tram Commute Model is that you can see the different local authorities are colored differently, and that reflects their relative population. So for example, the two different orange ones covered by this box here, they're both orange because they have more similar population number than the other ones. And you can see here, the little different, the patch in the center, because it's much smaller, its population will be slightly different. In NetLogo, if you right-click on an agent, you can inspect it. And in this model, the tram stops, like this one, where it says tram stop here, the places they can go to, and the houses are all agents. So you can see the details of the agents here. And the house doesn't look very house-like because it's got a commuter agent on top that's shaped like a green arrow. I made them green arrows so that you can see which direction they're facing. This one, for example, is about ready to leave the house because he's facing down the road towards the nearest tram stop. And these are generated based on the settings here on the left-hand side that we set before we hit Setup. You know, the video of running the Tram Commute Model won't work so well in PDF, but I'll give you a description of what it was, and hopefully when we post the PowerPoint slides, you will be able to actually see the video running. What it is in these little yellow houses, all the different little commuter agents, they sort of wake up in the morning and have a stretch and a cup of coffee and pick a place to go from among the different orange places to go. And they plot out how to get there, and then they move along these links, and then along the tram network links, and then along the other links towards the destinations. The links between one tram stop and the next are faster than the links between a tram stop and a house, or between a tram stop and a place. That is to account for the fact that trams are faster at moving through some areas than roads are. And this is a bit crude, so all of the roads move at the same pace as all the other roads, and all the tram sort of connections move at the same pace, which isn't realistic, but this is just a proof of concept model. Now here's the model code for the random setup. You see here it says if else projection equals random. So if projection equals random, you use setup random. And if it does not equal random, you use setup input. And the setup random code is here, and that shows you how the model creates a world and a number of agents and makes them change color according to population and lots of different things. And I have not posted the model code yet because I want to use it in the next webinar, but I have taken a lot of care to comment this model code quite extensively so that if you do decide to have a play around with it, you can see the logic behind the code and how all the different code blocks work together. So next, I want to talk to you about downloading boundary data from the UKDS. So this is if you don't want to run a random model, and I understand why you don't, because if we've looked at that random model, it didn't look very much like a real-world tram network. So you'll think, right, it's more important to build a real-world tram network and run some experiments on that. In that case, you need to go to, for example, the UK Data Service, Boundary Data Selector, in order to get Shapefiles. Now I chose local authorities from 2011, and if you want to get my specific files, you can go to this website or this tiny URL, which is a lot easier to type into. When you hit download on that boundary file, you will get a zip file with a shape file in it, a projection file, and then a couple of other things, you know, sort of some documentation and text files and some things. You will need to extract all of these files and put them either in the same folder as your model or at least a nearby folder to your model. That way your model can access the data. I also need, well, let me move back one page. When you download boundary data shape files from the UKDS, they will be polygons that describe the areas that you've selected. So for example, I selected 10 local authorities in the Greater Manchester area. So I have 10 big polygons that represent those local authorities. But I also want point locations for the tram stops. For that, I went to data.gov.uk and I downloaded this file from Transport for Greater Manchester that contains all of the Metrolink and rail stations. Now this comes as a CSV file, that's a comma-separated values file, but because it has easting and northing reference points, it will play nicely with my shape files. Easting and northing are sort of like latitude and longitude. They're geographical references that allow a CSV file to play nice with shape files. So you'll need to download something like this as well if you want point data. Finally, I also want line data. And for that, I went to Google Maps because someone had quite helpfully created a Google map of the current and proposed, accepted proposed Metrolink maps, lines in Google Maps. So here, again, you can download a file. This one's a KML file, which is keyhole markup language file. But just like the CSV, it contains easting and northing reference points, so it will play nice with your shape files. Finally, I wanted my local authorities to have about the right number of residents who might travel along the tram network. So I went to the UKDS Infuse website to download 2011 census data. Now that I chose to have some really simple data just because this is a demonstration, a proof of concept. You can, of course, get much more interesting data than this, but this is the total number of economically active individuals per local authority within the Greater Manchester area. Now you've got a lot of different files there. You've got a CSV, a shape file, an Excel file, and a KML file. Those files will not all play nice with NetLogo. So what I had to do was open QGIS or QGIS. It's a mapping software. There are other options, and you might find you might prefer a different one. So I won't go through all of the specific steps. It won't be very helpful if I show you how to do all the different steps in this program when you use something else. But the basic idea is that you have to import as layers all your different files. So I've got the tram stops here, I've got the tram lines, and I've got the local authorities. And you can filter those. So for example, the tram stops, I took out all the rail stations and I kept only the tram stations. Also, I wanted to add the population data. So on the local authority layer, I added a field for population and I copied over those numbers from the census data. That means that for each of these local authorities, each of these shapes now has a feature of population that I can access from within NetLogo. Okay, back to the code. This time it's a little bit difficult to see because my boxes don't quite line up. But here, in this first box, it loads the projection file. Now, a projection file is something that takes all of the different layers of your in your mapping software and puts them together and defines the total boundaries. So that way they all play nicely together. They're all using the same grid references. They're all talking about the same places. Then you see it loads the data sets of the different shape files. The .shp here is shape files. So I've got one for tram stops, one for tram lines, one for local authorities. Then it does a lot of stuff here where it asks local authority agents to be created, to draw lines, to change colors, to move around. That's all a little bit, it seems quite complicated, but this is actually copied from the GIS example that we saw earlier in the models library. So it's much more straightforward than it seems. Again, I have commented this pretty heavily, so when you get a hold of this file, if you choose to have a play around with it, you can sort of see the logic of each of these lines. Now, when we get into the NetLogo file again, this time we suggest instead of a random projection, we take Greater Manchester Local Authorities and we hit Setup. So this time you can see the map is not random, it matches the Greater Manchester Local Authority shapes. This one, for example, is Bolton. I just wanted to highlight one and I thought Bolton might want the attention. And then here, I'm just pointing out the tram stops and the tram lines match up with their real world coordinates. And they are still blue, so just the same as the random projection. The tram stops are still blue, and so that you can see them a little bit better. And when you add in the houses and the locations, it starts to look a little bit more complicated, a little bit more interesting, something you might want to run some experiments with. Just to let you know, a couple of the features that I glossed over earlier, they come into play here. I chose reduce population for display. I set that to on. What this does is it divides the total population by 1,000. If I didn't do this, you wouldn't be able to see the tram stops for the number of houses. And I also chose tram commute only, and I set that to on. What that does is it prevents, Bolton and Wigan and Stockport from having any houses or places to go because there are no tram stops in those local authorities. Now, if you're running experiments with this model, you might think, well, that's ridiculous. That's not what I want to test. And that's great. You can turn these on or off in your experiments as you need. But for display purposes only, it's a whole lot easier to look at it this way. So you might be thinking, okay, this is great. Well, what do I do with it, though? I mean, you could use different boundaries. You could look at Liverpool if you wanted to study the Merseyrail network, or you could look at London if you want to look at the tube and the overground and the Docklands Light Railway or anything else. You could use different kinds of data to guide the behavior of the agents. So I just used population to tell me how many agents to make per local authority, but you could get UKDS data on travel to work data, for example. That lets you know how many people from each area travel to each other area. Now, in my model, the agents just sort of randomly picked a place to go and went there. If you were to use travel to work data, you could really accurately plot their commutes. Now, that would exclude some interesting things. For example, you wouldn't capture whether those people ran errands on their way to work, but that they made other stops, You wouldn't capture all of the kinds of places that people go when they're not going to work. You wouldn't capture the kind of places that people go when they don't have a regular kind of work. So people who do freelance work, or who have more than one job, or who have different kinds of shift work. And depending on your research question, that wouldn't capture things like, you know, how women tend to do they have different travel patterns because they tend to collect children or drop off sort of dry cleaning or pick up things on the way home from work, and you get different kinds of travel patterns. And if you ignore those, then you end up ignoring the reality of how people use the transport network. I also want to say I only added very basic data to my models, so just the population. I didn't address income or education levels or health indicators, air quality, political party, who had won recent elections in these areas. You know, I didn't cover any of that, but maybe that's what you want to study. You could also, you sort of change the model to deal with community interactions. So if you're not interested in how people travel to get to and from work, but maybe you're interested in how well connected an area is, and what effect that has on that area's ability to maintain different kinds of communities. You know, if places that do or don't have a tram network, you know, do they maintain better dialect sort of distinctions, or do they maintain different religious sort of segregation, or are they more or less likely to have an artistic community develop? All of these kinds of questions could relate to travel data, and you know, there's ways you can test it. You can also add other kinds of data, maybe buses or bike lanes or private cars, canals, whatever you want to add. And I will discuss it extensively in my next webinar. But any of the changes that you want to make to a model, any different data you want to add, or you know, sort of features you want to add to their behavior, should relate to relevant output, because the purpose of these models is to ask interesting questions and test interesting theories. So you might create output that discusses that looks at how long people spend on traveling, and you can see whether social inequality contributes to or is a consequence of, you know, extended travel times, or maybe air pollution, or you know, employment opportunities. All of these could conceivably be related to travel access, but it's really hard to tell whether they're a cause of or a consequence of or a bit of both in relation to travel access data. But agent-based models can let you sort of tease apart those relations. So to summarize, there are a lot of verified, functional, documented models that you can explore in the models library and also online communities. Randomly generated models are very useful for testing. They allow you to check the model logic quickly, to rapidly cycle through build and test sort of phases. They allow you to test your code separately from your data. So if you try and test complicated code and real-world data all in one go and it doesn't work, it can potentially be quite hard to disentangle where the problem is. But if you test first with random data, and then you add your real-world data, it's a little bit easier to see where something might be going wrong. You can get sample output from the model and check the format, make sure it's suitable for your analysis for whatever you want to do with the data. There's a lot of other reasons I won't go into because this is just a webinar. There's also a wealth of real-world GIS, census, and other data to use. I mean, there's individuals who have created absolutely beautiful files out there, different kinds of maps, different kinds of CSVs. There are sort of official statistics that you can get that really accurately tell you about different kinds of areas, like the different census areas, right down to neighborhood and ward and small economic output areas. Really fantastic. And you just have to search for them. But you do have to put them together in a few different steps, and that can be a bit difficult to acquire, clean, combine, prepare the data. I actually found that was one of the more difficult steps of this model, because importing the real-world data into NetLogo was quite easy. I had a sample code to base my work on, and it only took about 36 lines. I'm sure people who really are a whiz at coding in NetLogo could get it in much smaller as well. But importing the data was simple compared to acquiring, cleaning, and preparing the data. So we have reached the end of the demonstration portion today, but I am happy to take your questions now. Do I know any Python packages for ABM? I don't know specifically what they're called. There are Python packages for ABM, and I mean, I don't know that it would be hard to find them because the Python online community really likes to tell you everything about Python. So I can't personally recommend a specific Python package for ABM, but they are available. What are the criticisms of ABM that you are aware of? Yeah, there's a few. I covered these a little bit in the introduction to agent-based modeling last week, but I'm happy to talk about them again because it is absolutely something people should be aware of. One of the criticisms is that not everything that you want to represent in the world, the kind of questions you want to ask, is easy to turn into something that computers will understand. So if you want to talk, for example, about maybe how access to transport relates to social exclusion, it's not necessarily trivial to define social exclusion in a way that a computer can measure it and give you a number to put into statistical analysis. You can sort of trivially say that it's a number between maybe 0 and 100, but depending on the models that you're looking at and the research questions you have, that might not be a sufficient representation. Some other problems are that some people just don't trust computers, and so if you come at them with an agent-based model and you say, look at all these shiny whiz-bang things I can do with it, they'll just say, nope, don't buy it, not even on double coupon day, get out. And some other problems with agent-based models are that people tend to rely them, if they accept that computers are useful for testing these kinds of questions, they tend to believe the answers a bit too much. They tend to, just really want the results of an agent-based model to be the truth. And that is a problem because it is not the truth. It is a truth according to a representation that may or may not match reality in important ways. But absolutely, if you still have further questions about the criticisms of agent-based modeling, feel free to talk to me. My email address and Twitter handle are up on the screen now, and you can absolutely tweet me. Can you recommend websites for downloading shapefiles relating to the Scottish population? I believe there is a Scottish government website that has shapefiles. I've definitely seen UK-wide shapefiles on the UK Data Service website. But I think if you want really detailed Scottish shapefiles, you'll have to look on Scottish websites. But you know what? I can get back to you. That if you want, I can send you an email as a follow-up to this, and I'll try and see what I can find. Where and how can I revisit these presentations? All of these presentations, we record them, we edit out the technical difficulties, and then we load them onto YouTube on the UK Data Services YouTube channel. I think the PowerPoint slides are also available, so if you don't want the sort of audio commentary to go with it, you just want to revisit a couple of the slides, that is also an option. And can I build these models in R? It is possible to build an agent-based model in R, but it is not what R is good at, and it is not really a good fit for these kinds of models. These are really properly object-oriented computational thinking models, and they are best built in an object-oriented software or in an agent-based modeling specific software like NetLogo. Okay, the next question is, to use GIS and other data in NetLogo, the polishing and organization of data needs to be done before importing, or can we do it in NetLogo? It is potentially possible to do some of it in NetLogo, but I find it is absolutely at least 126% better to do it before importing in NetLogo. Really, the shapefiles are the native file format for a lot of mapping software, and they are well equipped to open them, to edit them, to save them properly with all the changes you want to make. NetLogo is great at modeling the movement of agents, but it is not great at dealing with it's not great at editing the content of externally imported files. It can just about handle sort of text files and CSV files. It can open those, edit them, and save them again. But shapefiles are really a different beast altogether. Thank you for a really interesting webinar. You are very welcome. Thank you for joining. Also, please feel free to send in questions and suggestions for future webinars. We want to be at the cutting edge of what you're doing with new forms of data. So yeah, give us some ideas of what you would like to see. And do we have any literature recommendations about agent-based modeling parameterization based on real data? For instance, representing mobility patterns observed in a certain city into an ABM as a baseline scenario. That is quite a specific case, and I don't think I have any recommendations off the top of my head. I can certainly give you literature recommendations about how to build ABMs, how to test them, how to do parameter sweeps, how to run experiments, but they will be more generic, not necessarily based on mobility patterns and city specifics. On the other hand, I can look into it and I can send you a response after the webinar is finished. I think there should absolutely be a couple of very good published papers that use agent-based modeling and mobility pattern, sort of GIS data. There's one I saw about flooding. So they created maps of an area and they included the height of the ground in all of those areas, of the gradients, and then they showed how the movement of water and the movement of people can create areas that are more or less flood prone, and what that has to do with cutting areas off from access to different resources in flood situations. So absolutely, there are some brilliant examples out there, but I can't point them to you right off the top of my head. Let's see. Can agents have group behavior as well as individual? What I'm thinking of is that in the census, we can see that adults travel to work on a given location, but in the household, children go somewhere else. This would lead to modeling multi-purpose trips. Yes, absolutely, you can. You can set groups of behavior. You can set agents to have multiple trips. So in my model, I had agents acting more or less as individuals. They picked a place to go and they went. That's not very realistic because it doesn't include, stopping at the shops on the way to work or picking up the kids. You could set up your model differently. Mine was fairly light on complexity and detail, mostly because I wanted it to be something that beginners could potentially download and have a play around with. And if you want to download my model in 2 weeks after I make it available and have a play around and maybe add multi-stop journeys, they can have multiple destinations and then select paths from one and then from one to the next and the others. These are all definitely things you could do. And that would be a really useful way, for example, of adding realistic sort of behaviors into the model that might show you very interesting things about how areas are different in terms of how much time it takes people from one place to just get to work in the morning compared to people from somewhere else, The travel patterns are definitely related to a lot of social features that are not always easy to see how it lines up. Okay, thanks. You're very welcome. I was curious about how you were able to use data from Google Maps. My understanding is that you cannot download data from Google. Can you explain this a bit more? Yeah, it looks like in those, let's see if I can go back some pages. Underneath this window, there was, the 3 little dots that gives you more options. And one of them was download KML. And that is just something that I found I can do. I downloaded this one, I think, either in December or January. So unless they have radically altered their access system since then, which is possible because who knows what they do. But unless they have radically altered their systems in just the last month or two, you definitely can download keyhole markup language files from Maps. This does require a little bit of work in the QGIS software to get into a file format that's useful for importing into NetLogo. But it wasn't, you know, a particularly arduous process. It worked. Okay. On this website, there are a variety of different shapefiles. Oh, it looks like someone has provided an answer to where you might get Scottish shapefiles, and that is https://borders.ukdataservice.ac.uk/bds.html. So it looks like borders is, yeah, that's maybe where you want to go for your Scottish data. Are there any aspects of agent-based modeling research and practice that you think are particularly poorly understood or executed? Relatedly, are there any particular points that you think should be drummed into students in an agent-based modeling class? Asking from a teaching perspective. Well, thank you, Thomas. I have a lot of answers for this. The aspects of agent-based modeling in practice that I think are particularly poorly understood or executed relate to explaining how agent-based models are kind of a thought experiment that everyone can really open up and peer inside. A lot of people seem to want to treat them like magic balls that predict the future, and they absolutely do not. What they do really well is force you to lay out your thought experiment in a way that other people can have a peek at your thoughts, and that is both embarrassing sometimes and incredibly useful. But it's maybe not something people really stress when they're creating the models. And are there any particular points that you think should be drummed into students? Yes, and that is about computational social science thinking. It is a very different thing to approach agent-based models as a research practice than it is to approach asking surveys. Now, we all teach students who design surveys about how they write the questions and what kind of format the answers can be in and how that influences the potential ways that the question can be answered. And all of that is true of computational social science like agent-based modeling, but times at least 472%. It's much more important how all of these things are formatted and structured and how the rules are laid out. And people don't necessarily think as carefully about this as they do about surveys, because we can see so much clearer into a survey and what it is and why it doesn't allow me to answer the way I want. Whereas the model is, if it's shining and people, you know, the little agents are moving around and changing colors, we get a bit dazzled and we forget to look inside. And that is a problem that definitely teachers should encourage students to think carefully about. Is raster data acceptable for NetLogo? I believe it is, yes. In what circumstances do you recommend to use raster or vector data? This is not something I have a good answer to. I know that NetLogo can import both raster and vector data, but it is not clear to me why you might choose one or the other. I can try and answer that, or at least send you to the link that talks about how you import both of them and you know, why you might want to do so. And there's also another sort of community help response, thank you, Antonia, who has suggested that if you cannot get the data you want from Google Maps, try openstreetmap.org. They are definitely not going to be protective of their data in the way that Google might be. They are really about sharing the data and collaboration and everyone pitching in together to make good maps. So absolutely check out openstreetmap.org.